Hi, this is Brian at with HowRadiologyWorks.com. Today we're going to talk about contrast to noise and the impact that that has on the perception of objects, specifically simple objects in a uniform background. So what we're talking about today is called the Rose model. And if you're new to this channel, what we do here at How Radiology Works is we have bite-sized content that's of interest to people in the radiology field. So this here is Albert Rose, and what we're talking about is in the mid-late 1940s, he was the first one to propose actually a simple model for how the human visual system will interact with data that looks like this, where there's objects in a noisy background, and how those relate to the fact of how much contrast do those objects have from the background, how much noise is there, how large are they, how many photons are used, which would determine how much noise is there. So first we want to talk about contrast and noise. So we've talked briefly in other posts also about contrast. So contrast is the signal level of a given region above the background. So for instance, if the signal here, for instance, if this was a CT image, and if the signal was, say, 20 Hounsfield units above the background of, say, 40 Hounsfield units, so if this was 60 Hounsfield units and this was 40 Hounsfield units, then the contrast would be 20 Hounsfield units in that case. And then the contrast to noise, like we talked about, is the ratio of that contrast level to the noise that's in the background here. So obviously if there's more contrast and less noise, it's going to be easier to see. So if we just look at one area where we plant this, we say here the contrast is 3 here in these kind of arbitrary units. So we have the contrast of 3, and then if we go to noisier and noisier cases, we can say the contrast to noise ratio, we just take this level of contrast and then divide it by this level of noise. So if we go just across this table here, we can see that we're going to lower and lower contrast to noise ratio, so it becomes harder to visualize the structures. So right here, the contrast to noise ratio is very high. You can see all of these structures very easily. And if you really squint, you may be able to see the smallest structure, but it's definitely, we can see these structures here, but the smallest structure here is difficult to visualize. And all of these structures, by the way, they all have the same contrast in this case. So the contrast to noise ratio, then we go to lower contrast, so that's a contrast of 3. If we go to a contrast of 2, and then we do the same thing, where we go across. Now it's basically impossible to visualize that small object in the noisy background when we go to our lowest contrast to noise level. Finally, we have one more case where again we have the contrast additionally decreased, so now the contrast is 1, and then when we come here, it becomes even difficult if you don't know where those objects are. It becomes even difficult to visualize any of the objects in this last case with a very low contrast to noise ratio. So what we learned just from this simple kind of tutorial of looking and empirically looking at these images, we learned that somehow there's a relationship between the contrast and our ability to visualize the object, right? And somehow there's also a relationship between the size of the object. Albert Rose did a study in the 1940s and published what's called the Rose model, where our visual system, the SNR of our visual system, goes like the contrast of the lesion, and then also like the square root of the area of the lesion here. So depending on the size, for smaller areas, for smaller contrast enhanced areas, you would need to have a larger contrast to have the same detectability. And then n is the number of photons that are used in this ideal model. It assumes a perfect detector with no blurring, no additional noise. And so you can see here, now, in this case, rather than having the same contrast in all these simulated lesions, so again, simulated lesions in a uniform background, rather than having the same contrast, now we have higher contrast in this smallest lesion. And then you can see now, as we go to these more noisy scenarios, so a lower contrast to noise ratio, because we're keeping the contrast fixed in these cases, and as we go to that more noisy scenario, you can see now our ability to visualize these objects is similar. So I can still visualize the small objects even when I can visualize the kind of medium-sized objects, because we have a higher contrast within the objects. So the biggest takeaway here is a simple model. The simple Rose model, again, goes like the contrast linearly and then the square root of the area. So for instance, the area of a circle goes like the radius squared. So we can think of the fact that because it goes like the radius squared, and then this is a square root, the ability to visualize things will go like the kind of linear dimension of the circle, so the radius of the circle. So that's at a high level what we really wanted to have the takeaway is the contrast is very important, and the area, and then the noise, which will be determined based on the number of photons and then based on the detector as well. In future lectures, we'll talk about a more sophisticated model, which has to do with the signal to noise ratio as a function of spatial frequency, and we'll talk about that as well. But for today, I'll just leave you with, basically, would a perception model by any other name be quite as sweet? I don't think so. But what we talked about today, again, is the Rose model, and the Rose model talks about the fact that for an ideal case, it's the contrast and it's the size, namely the square root of the area, or for instance, if it's a circle, we'll scale linearly with the radius in terms of our ability to visualize objects. Again, these are very simple scenarios of a uniform object in a uniform background. Thanks again. This has been Brian Nett with HowRadiologyWorks.com. Comments down below. Let me know what your favorite part about digital X-ray imaging is. If it's just the fact that you don't have to develop film anymore, or specifically, what's your favorite part about this digital X-ray imaging? And also, hop on over to HowRadiologyWorks.com/digital X-ray, and you can see, in that case, we have just a one-page cheat sheet. Just download that. You'll have it at your fingertips. If you have any questions about the content here, you can use that to refer to in the future. Thanks a lot.